All right, so now I think we're good to go with the soundboard too. Okay, so let me know if you guys are good at the club. So I'm Alexander Williamson, and we're doing things just a little bit differently today. So bear with me if something takes a second to pop up on the screen or whatnot. But I think it should be good to go now. And if you guys can hear me all right, then we'll proceed. But technology is great until it's not. Also, anybody else who happened to join us, because this was going to be a private stream, welcome to a talk. You guys are going to get a sneak peek of a club talk. So yes. All right. Well, thanks again for having me. And today we're going to be talking about the 15 tropical fish. There's not just 15, but 15 of the really important tropical fish in the hobby that are true tropical fish. So tropical fish in the sense that you would think of as 80 degrees or 78 degrees, needing probably some aeration, needing a little more care than, say, carp, goldfish, koi, paradise fish, things like that. And we're going to talk about some of the earliest fish in that regard. But before we get to that, we're going to also talk about the big strides in fish history, in the hobby history and world history, essentially, that allowed for our hobby to get to where it's at today, where we can have the things we have. So let me pull up the slideshow. You probably don't need to have me in full screen, so we can let me know if this is a good size for you guys, and then we'll proceed here. All right. So I do want to say, first of all, as we start, I really want to thank the book and the author, Dr. Klee, or Clay as it's pronounced, but it's spelled Klee, for the book Toy Fish. It's a really great resource of old artwork and stories of the hobby. Probably the best one I've found in the hobby to date. Quite honestly. So I wanted to start off by saying that, the aquarium hobby, obviously to you guys down in Venice, is something you probably have been surrounded by your whole life, the farms, things like that. And so I wanted to just kind of start out by saying, Florida was geographically positioned excellently to share in all those Central American fish and all those South American fish that needed to make it by either sailing ship or steamliner early on in the 1800s. And so it really was a pivotal, place with Miami, Tampa, Fort Myers, all over, all up into Tallahassee. New Orleans even became also an important place over in Louisiana, because time was of the essence. You'd have to do it in the warm season, and then you'd bring big blocks of ice oftentimes to keep things cool. And they'd either bring back specimens or they'd bring back some fish. But the problem was that, oftentimes things would die. They didn't know about aeration. They didn't know about ammonia. They didn't know about those things quite yet in the first part of all this. And so Florida actually had a lot of the first fish in the hobby that the rest of the country didn't have. So there may be something in this talk where you're thinking, well, hey, I've seen a picture from 4 years before you said, where that fish is in our local I guess menagerie of fish. And that is very possible. Also, the other thing I want to point out is that I do a lot of this research by looking at photos, looking at ship manifests, looking at old magazines, club articles, and things like that. And a lot of times someone will say something, and back then they didn't have the internet. A lot of times they didn't even have phones when we're talking about the early hobby. And so there was no way to double check when someone in San Francisco may have gotten a load of goldfish from Asia and someone in New York simultaneously got a load from Amsterdam or something. So for instance, on the Erie Canal, they were building it, and they're talking about how goldfish were a nuisance in the ponds and how workers kept putting them in there thinking that they would eat mosquitoes. Yet the first goldfish, if you Google it, didn't come into the United States until the 1870s. So there's like a 40-year gap from when they started that to when that goes on. And yet there's also reports of things like Benjamin Franklin bringing electric eels into the picture early on. But we'll get back to that. So let's continue. I want to say now that Florida has a $172 million wholesale industry, and that is the farms, that is the wholesalers and importers, and only ornamental fish, as said by last year. They came out with a report. It was looking at the year 2019, so it's actually probably grown since then. But then the Florida Aquaculture Lab did an even more thorough investigation into that, and they noted that if you count all the shops, all the home breeders, all the people involved together, that number is easily doubled on the retail sales figure. And if you look at all the pet stores, and then people who have a job, people who are making a living through that, people who are selling foods or whatever, botanicals and sea salt, sand, whatever it may be, it's easily, just in Florida alone, $1 billion industry for ornamental fish. So it's really become mainstream. It's really become a big thing. And I think a lot of people from other places may not know that. And maybe that's just, everyday news to you guys down there. But I wanted to make a point of that to talk about where we are now before we jump back into how we got here. So let's bring this back up and take a look at the imagery I've got arranged. Oh, whoop, that's too close. See, these are the technical issues that I knew we'd have. All right, let's give this a go. All right, so early on, we were keeping fish, and some of the first fish that we kept were going to be completely native fish. Whatever you could keep in your area is what you could keep, period. And a lot of the fish, when we see this Aquatic Life magazine from 1922, we can see that they've got African butterfly fish. They've got angelfish, like a Scalara angelfish. They've got goldfish in there. They've got a gourami. They've got danios. And so these may be things, maybe a little platy or molly or something right there, and maybe a top minnow of some sort there. But this is kind of what I consider the modern era. So what we're going to be talking about today is actually before this era, because this is when things are kind of fully fleshed out. And the main issues that you have to contend with were things that basically kept us. Here's an article from 50 years earlier, and this was the very first publication out of New York. It was a club that met, and they all spoke in German because the hobby was so entrenched in German culture that they were all newly immigrated or emigrated German immigrants. And they met in this club in New York. And after that, it became a storefront and a bigger club, bigger and bigger. And 1877 was really when Americans, English-speaking Americans, started getting involved, and they started this newsletter or journal. And you can see here that when they're talking about the aquaria that they were able to keep at the time, all the pictures are native North American or European cold water fish, or medium lukewarm water fish, however you want to consider that. And they had gar, they had catfish, they had pike, sunfish, things like that. And because of that, things like the sunfish were very popular because they were colorful. Now, if we go back even another 30 to 50 years from then, back to the 1830s through the 1850s, there wasn't even a standardized way to keep fish, really. It was a new concept to put fish in a glass box. And you can give credit to different people, but I always like to give credit with the research I've done. You're going to Google it, and you may find, a name that pops up if you just say who invented the aquarium, because there's someone who first mentioned it in publication. There's someone who first met at a meeting of naturalists. And then there's someone who first built it and then wrote a journal about it, but it didn't get published till years later. And that, in the case of the latter, that is Jeanne Villepreux Power. And she was born a poor French girl out in the countryside. and she was a very smart woman. In the early 1800s, around 1810, she, with all the French Revolution stuff that had just gone on and all the crazy Napoleon antics going on, if you know your history, you know it's kind of a crazy time, but she became a seamstress for the what was left of the royal family, basically. And she fled after falling in love, or at least marrying, a man who was part of that French aristocrat uh, group. And so she moved down to Naples. And as early as 1822, she was having the locals construct glass boxes with 4 sides of glass and a bottom of slate. And she was French, so she's speaking French, but she had several words that she would use that were just different configurations with aquaria at the center of it. And she wrote through correspondence for 20 years. And it was these jars and things that they kept fish in for a long time. And she's really the first person to say, let's take the whole ecology. Let's take the mud. Let's take the snails. Let's take the stones, all of it. And let's put that into our aquariums. Let's not just look at our fish in dead specimen containers as naturalists throughout Europe kind of did before that. Edinburgh, Berlin, Hamburg, and the Amsterdam all kind of had centers where they were playing with fish in the 1700s and 1800s. And there were things like koi and carp and catfish and eels that were kept all the way back to the Roman times and even earlier, and the Egyptians. We won't go into all of that. That's another talk. If you guys were up in Pasco County when I talked, I covered that. But the talks, there's versions of it online, and I'm happy to come back to a club in the area and do another talk on the ancient history of it. But we're going to talk more about these first tropical fish. And about them, we first had to figure out, okay, how are we going to keep them? And so we get these aquariums by the mid 1800s. You can see here is an 1850s paludarium where it's fish and it's plants and it's kind of all contained, kind of a terrarium setup. And this basically is one of the first pieces of about 5 pieces that we needed to figure out in order to get the aquarium going. So the next thing was going to be filtration. And there were filtration setups in the sense of like bog filters and accidental filtrations going on non-mechanically on, decor and pieces of coral and things that people would decorate their tanks with. Or for instance, the Greeks and Romans, they had fountains oftentimes, and that kept the water from being stagnant and having as many mosquitoes, and so did the fish. But they didn't necessarily know that it was aeration, that the fish needed it to go through their gills. And all that scientific work is going on all throughout the 17 and 1800s, where they're finally understanding, oh, ammonia is building up. That's the thing that's going on. Oh, there's a nitrogen cycle. All these things that now today are kind of taken as basic building blocks of the hobby, they didn't necessarily have. So this is a good, this is actually a filtration system with a heating line also on it. And it has an inflow and outflow. And then at the time, this was electric, which was a real forerunner. Because before that, you'll see there were 4 ways to heat a tank. And we're assuming that if you live in North America or Europe, maybe summer you don't need to heat the tank, but the rest of the year you sure do need to heat the tank. And obviously it would freeze otherwise in a lot of parts of the country, especially before electricity. You're not going to necessarily have your tank right next to your fireplace. It would get too hot. So what we see, these are the 4 main ways of heating tanks at the time, which underneath you'd have a slate bottom usually, and you would heat it with a whale oil or some sort of oil, kerosene sometimes, but usually whale oil was the most common thing that you'd get back in the 1800s and all the way up into 1910 or so. So you would use a whale oil that would burn slowly with a wick, and you would heat that tank, and you'd have a thermometer with the old school mercury, and you would just have to constantly monitor it. So really, that's not a good system unless you're in a lab and have someone there 24/7. So it was very, very tedious work to try to keep something alive once they realized that's what it needed, was that consistent temperature. There's also this center column made out of ceramic or metal that would heat up and diffuse. There's also having a void, like in picture B, where they would heat up like a terracotta or a slate, like empty vessel in there, and then basically like a stone, like you could bury to cook like Kahlua pork or something. They'd have that buried under substrate and in the bottom of the tank, and that would get heated by open flame. So also very dangerous. Then you've got like the lantern style number A, and that's a little less dangerous. We're not dealing with an open flame that could get kicked over, or with quite as easily boiling the fish, because you have indirect water entering that's heated. And so you could heat it to something like 100 degrees outside the tank, and then have that match the 60-degree water in the tank, and boom, you end up with whatever, 80-degree water. I mean, you'd have to work that out. But these are within just a number of years of each other. You see patents being filed in the US and in Germany, in the United Kingdom, and in Paris. And you see all sorts of systems like auto water changing systems, like air coming up through the bottom, like under gravel filters, essentially. And where you have a storage tank of water where you have the thermometer, and you make sure that that's the right temperature before you scald the fish accidentally, or boil them or poach them from underneath. And all of this was figured out mostly due to these expos they had in the 1850s. And later they would sort out even more details as rich folks who went to the big expos said, I want to take that home. I want to figure that out. I want to have a version of that crazy new technology with me. And the last piece that we kind of have to get to is how they were transported. And I could do a whole talk on German cans. They're called German cans because they're from, they're from Columbus, Ohio. They're called that because of a guy who happened to be, no, he wasn't German. He just lived in a place called Germantown, because there were a lot of German settlers there. But this Germantown fella, Molleret, but he went by the anglicized version of it. And he came up with these cans using dairy cans, and he had different versions, but one had basically a bicycle hand pump, like the penny farthing big front wheel bicycle, where you would pump up the air and you could pressurize the can, as well as you'd put bubbles through the can while doing that. Now, it wasn't necessary to pressurize the can, but the air pumping, the aeration, that did play an important role. And then up above, you can see in the top can labeled air, they'd actually put pieces of ice in that top can, and it would melt and drip into there. And then they'd have an overflow system. And then even earlier on, this is all happening in 1877 to 1882. He's really working on different versions of this. He also had basically different setups where the hand pumps outside the thing. And where these all came into play, he also then figured out in the winter, this can down on the bottom right, that you needed air, and that worked as a great insulation around the sides. So you couldn't just have the tin can or whatever with, the Arizona heat. If you're shipping fish from, say, Chicago to San Diego, or across the country on a train. And the steam engines and things were a really big part of what changed the speed of all of this. But here you go. You can see M. Molleret, or H. Molleret, rather, sorry. And they had these set up so they could stack. And he started manufacturing them out of Cincinnati, Ohio. And there happened to be quite a few fish farms for specifically goldfish in the area. So they got pretty good at shipping goldfish, but they couldn't keep the temperature. They couldn't do anything other than melt ice and keep it cool at first. So heating was the real problem. And it was overcoming that, or coming up with a way to ship fish in the right time of year fast enough, that really ended up being the issue. And whether it was over land or sea, this was the solution. This was the final fifth piece of that puzzle, which is you got to have a steam engine or an electrical engine or a gas engine, doesn't matter, some sort of engine basically. And you've got your early stagecoach train here. This is probably late 1830s, early 1840s. And soon after that, you start seeing the trains you think of nowadays. Well, also going on during this time, people were playing with air pumps, and there were steam powered air pumps. There's patents for them. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of patents from this period in the US alone. And they did it for all those different sorts of things, for industry and for the fish hobby. But the fish hobby kind of was very wealthy folks and naturalists or people backed by universities or by a wealthy person who wanted to keep fish. And oftentimes these wealthy people had traveled around the world, or maybe they were someone in the aristocracy in the UK or in the United States who had been in the military, and they'd been stationed, for instance, in the late 1800s. They've been stationed somewhere on, the Philippines or Hawaii or the Falklands or wherever, and on their way to these places, they'd pass through the tropics and they'd see some of the amazing stuff there. And it started becoming popular to read these novels and illustrative books and things, and little 5-cent journals and things like that, or penny sheets that were basically stories, kind of like Tarzan, but people explaining the adventures and the crazy fish. And some of them are accurate and done by naturalists, others are really crazy. But this right here, this picture of the air pump, the Electrozoan, this is the 1924 unit that was only $40, which is a lot back in 1924, but it's doable. It's not like buying a car in order to keep your fish, or having to have servants watch the fish 24/7 to make sure they don't boil. And that is an improvement. But meanwhile, I just wanted to mention that, like, this is the kind of train that you probably would think of in your head as the steam engine days. And you get into tanks being really common. People are shipping these tanks from Sears and Roebuck magazine even before the car and before electricity. And they are starting to get these tanks and get pretty good at keeping native fish. And for you guys in Florida, almost the entire United States fish hobby and trade was completely native stuff, other than koi and goldfish early on. So it was all, with the exception of in 1869, a French soldier by the name of Gerard. We don't know his last name. Don't ask me how we got his first name, and knew he was French, but we didn't get his last name in the equation, but we didn't. And he brought in a bunch of these paradise gourami fish into Portugal in 1869 in Europe. That's really the first colorful, semi-tropical. And the truth is, they're found all the way up towards the Korean peninsula and all the way down into the true tropics. So they're kind of not a true tropical fish, in the sense that, like bettas, they don't thrive necessarily at room temperature, but you could probably keep them in a 60-degree temperature for a while, or whatever, an AC air-conditioned PetSmart little cup is. It doesn't mean they're doing well. It means that somebody could have got them and had them in a tank for a little while. And honestly, a lot of tanks, before they understood cycling, people would go collect things or hire someone to go collect things for them from the local streams, rivers, and creeks, and then they'd bring them back, or the beach if they were on a coastal area. Saltwater tanks were much more popular than freshwater initially in that 1800s period. From 1850 to say 1890, saltwater was more popular because you could bring buckets of new saltwater every day if you lived on the coast. However, just like that German can, that was in Ohio. So people in Ohio are feeling left out, people in Chicago. So they're trying to keep things that were in that picture from 1877, and they're keeping native fish. But a lot of the native fish are really big, and honestly, they're pretty aggressive. So there's kind of this desire and a big hole in the marketplace of upper middle class as well as upper class to have something a little bit more colorful and a little smaller. And now we have the technology all kind of coming from different directions. But finally, and the fish we're going to list, don't worry, there'll be an actual list of 15, but there's not only so much you can say about the list. So I wanted to get to how we got to this modern list. And here you can see in 1916, a fellow by the name of Robert Shaunter of New York City, he had the first setup with completely electric and completely everything was set up so that it was auto water change. He had switches for everything. He had little feeding automated setup, and it was all electric. Including the heating coils and things, and people were constantly in this 1900 to 1920 period. They were constantly putting out new inventions. A lot of them never got actually tried. They just wanted to be the first one to publish the invention. And so there's all sorts of patents, some of them that don't work, some of them that did. But around this time really is when we figure out a whole lot. Also, World War I was going on during this time, and that totally changes our understanding of logistics and shipping things in a hurry from one place to another across oceans. And whether it's manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution, yeah, that started in the 1700s, and textiles and things. But really, it hits its stride in the mid 1800s with a lot of things, and then by 1900 is when you start seeing electricity added to the equation, gasoline and diesel, and kind of these higher power things. And you start seeing a lot more metallurgy and understanding of electricity, understanding of chemistry. And we end up really by, I would say, 1915, 1916 with the modern hobby. If you have the money, if you're at a university, or if you're a rich person in any major city in America, you could have these things manufactured. And clubs have been springing up all in that intermediate period, all across there. So here's an 1897 species list. And I want you guys, if you're in the Venice Club down there, if you guys can make it out, the Heteranda formosa, the least killifish, Gambusia affinis. You've got a few things in here that are like mollies, platies, but you've also got top minnows. You've got Elosoma evergladei. You've got a lot of these may have changed their Latin name since this listing, but you also see paradise fish. And so I just wanted to show you, if you lived in Daytona Beach, you were in the place to be. Also, you guys could get a dozen alligators for 18 bucks. What a deal. What a steal. Hyacinths, you'd have to pay $3.50 for a dozen of them, or water ferns $4. So kind of interesting. Also, the fact that parrot's feathers, the plant that is kind of invasive now, and all these milfoil and things like that, anacris and elodia, a lot of that stuff was going for 75 cents, $1 a stem, because it filled up space. It was very nice and lovely to see. But these are kind of fish that could be zipped across the Yucatan from the Yucatan Peninsula or Central America across the Caribbean to Florida. The problem was, even that German can had a hard time shipping these into the inner cities and things. And so really it was these fish on this list that people had for about a 20-year period. And what we're talking about today, most of all, is going to be when you start seeing publications putting out, the amazing Amazon molly, things that need a little more heat. This is 1921. You can also see they have some cichlids by this point. They have the zebra Daniel, or the zebra fish, which is confusing because they also called convict fish and zebra acara type fish. They called those zebra fish as well. And then they've got, a golden top minnow or some sort of killifish here. So a lot of what I do to do the research is I look at, these old ads, these old personal ads. You go look at an old either magazine or even a newspaper, and you can see the change in things. By 1925, you can see that they had gobies, they had chana or snakeheads, they also had what they call ball fish in these same ads, and that is the pufferfish had the name ballfish first, the Tetradon catacutia, or ballfish. Also, there's all sorts of, by this point, you see all sorts of, right after World War I, you see all sorts of killifish coming in from West Africa. because it was a quick trip back to Europe. You also see on this list that they have angelfish available for any serious people in big cities, and that is that's a big shift, and that is, in my mind, that solidifies, okay, we can cross off our list that in 1925, 1921, they had angelfish in Germany on this list, written in English, oddly enough, in post-World War Germany. So the Brooklyn Aquarium Society, we're going to hop back a minute, but to 1903, they started dealing with these fish from America, and they started putting out proportions and ways to rate and have competitions with, like, the banded sunfish, or with a pumpkin seed fish. It's fish that they could find in the American South. That's what they had to work with. And I agree that there are many beautiful fish, but they're kind of the cold water fish that they could keep in ponds and things. And that's what a lot of people were working with. And you see that as late as 1903, that they're still focused on that. So really, you can see everything from pictures to a lot of my work I do by saying, okay, we found this picture dated 1901, and it's it's a silver lithograph or whatever of a sunfish or of a cichlid. And so that lets you know it's there. At the same time, though, you see the last of the little stickleback, which I like that it's, they're 2 or 3 inches long at best. And then they've got it with like a 30-pound catfish and a giant, whatever, gar, an alligator gar. But these are all fish in books about keeping fish, assuming that you'd keep them just as easily. So here we are getting to the list, guys. I know people probably just wanted a 5-minute top 10 list, but I wanted to get some of the backstory in there and some of the important innovations that happened before we could get there, because a lot of people take for granted now that you can buy a kit at a big box store. I know most of us who are big into the hobby don't do that, but some of us do. So here you can see Gambusia, Jordanella, and Goodii, or Goodie, which is the bluefin killie is what's up top, and that's a beautiful fish that I was just down in Florida a few months ago, or a month and a half ago, and that lit up my world. I don't know why that ever fell out of favor. I hope that comes back soon. Also, you see these old poor quality photos, but you can see that people were keeping different killifish, top minnows, also pupfish. All that's going on at the turn of the century. And here you can see in the late 1800s, people in the colony of Thailand, or Siam at the time, the British held it, they were figuring out how to take pictures of fish. And here is the zebra danio after it was discovered. It wouldn't be officially named until 1904, coincidentally the year that it was imported into Europe and the United States as well. It was imported via a guy named Frank Locke, and it will be one of the first fish on our list here of the truly tropical fish. Now, we say that, and this fish is another one that's so sturdy that actually it can survive cooler temperatures, but it does thrive in tropical temperatures. But you can see they're trying to make an edgeless area to start actually photographing these things so that they're more accurate than some of the early drawings. I mean, you had some great drawings early on, like this, but in other times people were less than accurate, and you didn't know if it was a little bit of storytelling and a little bit of exaggeration going on. It really depended on who was telling the story. And there wasn't really a unified group of authoritative sources other than, University of Harvard, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Berlin. And then you start seeing clubs like the Hamburg Aquarium Society, which later becomes the DATZ, D-A-T-Z group, which is still where we get our L numbers, and later on inspired the CW numbers for Corys, but the L numbers for plecos that don't have Latin names. So it's just a reminder that the hobby is ahead of the organized science very frequently. Now, this is one little hole or wrinkle in my plan of giving you the list, which is there is a truly tropical fish that is very sensitive, I'm told, by people like Anthony Mazeral, who is who is a PhD, and that would be the electric eel. There are stories of an electric eel being studied by Benjamin Franklin. Pardon me one sec, I have to sneeze. Sorry, guys. All right, so the problem is nobody can verify how an electric eel made it to Philadelphia in 1781. There's a story of it happening and him putting a key in the water, and oh my goodness, electricity, you can draw it through this, you can put copper wire on it. I don't know if it's a true story. So if anybody down there in Venice is interested in history and knows some details that have any sort of firsthand accounts, I'd love to hear it, because this would be 100 years plus earlier than any true tropical fish being kept in a cold part of the country. So especially since it would have been sailing ships bringing electric eels to Benjamin Franklin, I'm wondering if he just heard stories of these fish, or if someone down in colonial South America in some place maybe tried studies in the field and reported back to him. Anyways, I just know that somebody might bring that up, and I can't find any true proof of it. It's all secondhand discussion of it, and most of it arises in the 1920s while retelling his biography, it seems like. So obviously we had the goldfish, and that is the last hurrah of what we're going to talk about in the old style of fish keeping before we get to our list, which obviously I told you 1869 we have this anomaly, which is the paradise fish, and that is the start of your truly beautiful, bright tropical fish that do live in tropical waters. Now this one's a borderline fish, but what we did with it quickly is we started coming up with different morphs and different color morphs, and within about 30 years you start seeing, by the late 1800s, by the 1890s, you start seeing albino ones, you start seeing melanistic ones, and now we've got all sorts of color morphs, and especially in Asia they're still very fond of these fish. They're very rugged fish and they can survive very easily, so it's going to be on the list, even though it kind of just barely squeaks on there. But it is the introduction. It is the thing. Goldfish came over in 1611 for sure, but it appears that in 1589 they also came on a ship. But nevertheless, by 1611 they were in Holland. 10 years after that, they're being bred in Berlin. 10 years after that, they're being bred in Russia. So very quickly, goldfish, koi, those were all over the place. And so I don't really group this with those earliest of fish that came in, but I do consider it different. Now, the first real wild, fully tropical fish that enters the hobby, it's as early as 1888, and it's the butterfly fish out of Africa, the African butterfly fish. And these are still a weird fish. I still haven't seen anything about anybody line breeding crazy traits out of them necessarily. I mean, maybe they have some a little bit different, I don't know what you'd call it, like finnage or traits like that. But really, we haven't seen a whole lot come out of them. Also, at the same time, you see, hold on, pardon me, I have to sneeze one more time. We have terrible forest fires going on here, and the smoke is awful. I am so sorry, guys. Okay, so after this, after the African butterfly fish, these were brought in by a fellow by the name of W.K. Peters. He's also who the elephant nose fish, the Peter's eye mormarid, is named after. And he brought these out of out of the what would be called Sudan today, but was called the Deep Nile or the Upper Nile back then, and brought them back into Germany, and then brought them back into the hobby. Now, another one that kind of gets the mention that's kind of on the edge is the Dojo Loacher, the weather loach. These were kept by sailors in the tropics because they knew from locals that kept them in Japan and also in mainland Asia that these would go wild if there's more than about a 7 or 8 millibar, 10 millibar change in pressure dropping. Because in that part of the world, that often means that the wet season is starting, or that there's a big thunderstorm. And that means that they're going to have water and they're going to be able to travel. So they can sense that. They can smell ozone in parts per trillion. And so they are a fish that's super sensitive to that. And so sailors all throughout what they called at the time the Orient, the Spice Islands, they would keep these in barrels, and you don't really have to keep these very. They can come up and breathe air, and they're very sturdy. They can live out of the water if the humidity is up in the 60-70% area. They can live out of water for about a day. They're a really rugged fish. Nevertheless, though, people started breeding them into a little more ornate lines, like the Golden Dojo. You start seeing in these publications. And it had to make a long trip out of Asia back over into Europe and the US hobby. Um, you also see the albino kind, or the golden, or 24 karat, whatever you want to call it. But these ones have a lot of eyesight problems and things. But they're truly, these ones truly really need a little more care and are truly a tropical fish. A lot of the fancy things we did to things like guppies and so forth, they were so inbred or so specifically kept. Like, even though the wild guppy, the wild swordtail, can withstand some cooler temperatures here and there, when we started getting into fancy breeding, especially within the early to mid 20th century, getting big fins and things, they lose heat much quicker with those big fins. And so, with between that and infections and all sorts of other things, as well as the fact that they've lived for, say, 10 generations in water that is kept at a warm temperature for them, a lot of these fish that have a lot more plasticity out in the wild when wild caught, they kind of lose some of those traits when they're being line bred. So another one that's really early in that top 15 that I have to give a shout out to are the Victorian mouth brooders. They are the Egyptian mouth brooder. They were called the Victorian mouth brooder at the time, sometimes the Nile mouth brooder. But these were brought in very early. To me, I was surprised when I kept running into them over the last several years of reading about these, just how frequently they were brought in. But they were brought in by many trips, especially through Egypt, and then later with the building of the Suez Canal, kind of out of that area and what we call modern day Israel and Jordan. Seemed like a lot of people were already keeping them there, and they brought them out. Now, another one that was brought pretty early was the cherry barb, and they went from looking like a mildly good-looking fish, I guess, into a long fin, very pretty, very pigmented fish. This one's got the red eyes, so this is a little later, but you start seeing these deep colors and the long fins, like I was saying, the line breeding. And with live bears, they're really, even though they may have been in the hobby, people thought not much of them because, when you look at this, it's like, oh, well, I'll just keep a local top minnow instead. It's not that great. But what they soon found out is that a lot of these, including guppies, including, swordtails, mollies, platies, a lot of goodeids early on, that actually, they have the ability, they have the genetics to bring out all sorts of colors. Albinism and melanism when they look dark, with melanism all dark. Albinism when they look all this color, or leucistic traits where they may not have the melanin in them, but they've got the red and yellow pigments. That also accounts for a lot of the early morphs in fish across the board. And so you start to see things like this, where it's not necessarily a true albino, it may be a leucistic, or like these, they don't have any scales on their second half from the lateral line down. So that would be called a leather or smooth fish. And going back to the 1500s, Franciscan monks were doing this and calling them leather carp or mirror carp. And that is actually what, in 1908, the Japanese went to Europe to seek out the so-called European koi, and they crossed the leather or scaleless carp, which was just simply for the fact that it was a pain in the butt to scale fish every day for meals and things. And so they got rid of that, and they selectively bred it out. By the 1400s, it's very clear that they had scaleless versions of many fish in Europe, all native European fish, but it is that scaleless leather carp, as it's known, that was crossed in Japan with koi to make doitsu koi. So all doitsu koi are mirror carp and leather carp crosses. So then the next fish that comes in, and this one was a big splash. I mean, people wrote about it all over the place in the hobby. There was all sorts of publications, all the way from 1904 when it really first enters the South American um, the South American versions of when you get the big sail fins and things. Uh, and they kept coming out with new color morphs or new collection points. And same with the guppy as well, which they called the millions fish in Europe. But it was very, very popular. And later on, you can obviously, that there's all these color morphs. And so, like I was saying, this chart illustrates it very well. All the different colors that you can have and create and mix with these fish. It really makes it an interesting palette, even working with one fish if you just keep one type in the aquarium. So they also worked on making these fish more and more robust as time went on. And so you start seeing them spread, and you start seeing cities getting known, like Chicago, and their club is known for, the Dalmatian variety or the long fin variety of something. And all the way up through today when we see like the balloon bodies and the smushed fish, that to the point where it's detrimental to their survival. These things are a great example of fish that just simply wouldn't survive or thrive out in the wild, nor would they survive with cool temperatures coming in too much. They've just been so inbred that they've got a lot of issues. They've got organ issues, infection issues, so on and so forth. So the next one that I'm going to mention on the list, and this is actually first noted in 1866 by explorers and things. You've got your cyclosomas, as they were called at the time. You've got everything from your black cichlid or cyclosoma to your black line to your chameleon. And really, what you're seeing is you're seeing acaras and acara variants. And right at this same time, it's really 1897 that Florida imports some, and that they're able to keep them in ponds just fine south of Tampa. Around Tampa and south, basically, is kind of that line where they were having success keeping them. And now you can find them all over the place down there in Florida, unfortunately. But you see lots of varieties that were all kind of called the same thing a lot of times, and they may have been different varieties of, an acara. They may have been a black acara or a striped one, or they could have even been early hybrids from being in ponds with everything else, until you get to the point where you think of like the metallic blue acaras today. We started seeing blue acara in the hobby that were very bright and everything. Early 1930s is when we start seeing the metallic traits and things. But a lot of these things were not that exciting. And if you'd ask someone at the time in an aquarium club, like, which fish is your most exotic or rarest, the answer might surprise you. It might be something like these little Mexican Tetra. And these are the cave tetras that most people know in their cave form, but they also just live in Mexico in the rivers as well. And the next little tetra that we see enter the hobby is the flag or red line tetra. It's gone through a lot of different names, but this one surprised me that it was as early as 1892 that these tetras started surviving trips all the way back to Germany and into New York. People didn't seem to get the hang of breeding them or anything until around 1900. And when you see the guppies and all these live bears and things coming in, I think it was just a lot easier to work with those and to breed those. And that's why they're next on our list. Also, it's very plausible that endlers could have been in the mix, even though it's really not till later that they're officially discovered. But there's not good notation of where the locals collected things and then sold them to people in port cities who would be in the trade. But all during this time is when you start seeing the farms pop up for the goldfish and the koi around the U.S. at that turn of the century. And you start seeing farms pop up with like cherry barbs in New Orleans, outside of New Orleans. Down in the Tampa area, you start seeing the start of people keeping big ponds and trying to breed other stuff too. And of course, as I said before, you get all these color variants within one species, and this is modern day talking. But the guppy was kind of an unassuming like starter pet, kind of like we think a goldfish now or a comet goldfish now. And they actually were mostly kept in glass bowls. If your house was heated, as it is today in the same temperature range, most people didn't worry about the temperature dipping down to around 60, and that it would be okay. It wouldn't get ick, wouldn't have those issues as readily in the 1940s and 50s. But after that, really a lot of breeding went on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with these big crazy tails and things. And that's when a lot of that resiliency started to change. And also people were keeping them in warmer tanks because they breed faster, they live shorter, but they breed faster. And with live bears, well, with all fish, but with live bears, it's especially true, especially power feeding them. Now, what came after guppies, and I actually have on my YouTube channel, I forgot to mention I'm a YouTuber, but I'm one of those guys. But on my YouTube channel, I actually have series on a lot of these fish in particular. So I feel like I haven't said hi to you guys in a while. So I'm just this face talking with a slideshow going. So hello again. I'm going to take this right. We're almost done, but I wanted to mention, by the way, so I am an archaeologist by training, an anthropologist, and a historian. So I got my history degree, had to get an anthropology degree to enter archaeology school. And so I did cultural anthropology. And so it really fascinates me how people have played with these fish and toyed with these fish. And so on my channel on YouTube called The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium, I like to look into stories of who was the first person to breed that fish. When did we first see this? Or what's the newest study saying? And a lot of times it totally reinvents what we know about things. Now, the convict cichlid, like we're seeing here, is a fish that was brought in. But yet today we still see Honduran red points. We see things like flower horns, where people are using genetics and mixing and different collection points and rarity, or zebra acaras, for instance. Those are still commanding a price, even though they were fish that were here way before angelfish and tetras, other than the flag and Mexican tetra, red line tetra, way before a lot of things, yet they still hold this charm. So what's old is new again, and I like to explore that. And when we find out, oh, this fish actually has the ability to do this or that, or this fish that we think was extinct is surviving in a small place. So I like to tell stories about that on my channel, and it's what has driven a lot of my research, is just finding out these little jewels and gems of stories. So continuing on there, then you can see that the convict cichlids, very early on, they were able to get colors out of them, at least like soft blues, and the striping obviously is very stunning. And then you start getting a lot of even rainbow coloring when they're spawning. Now we have another fish here, and this is, I don't know how it popped out of order, but that is the Mexican cave tetra I was talking about, where the Mexican cave tetra has the blind version that lives underground in Mexico. This is what they look like wild out in stream. So it's kind of a nice fish, but this is really kind of like spawning top-notch colors. It's not probably what it looks like after being in a German can on a train, for a week. So really when all of this is going on, World War I is going on shortly after all these early first tropical fish. And so the thing that I want to also mention is planes are invented in this time. Cars, first electric, then gasoline, are also invented during this time. And all of this is allowing us to travel faster and faster, allowing us to communicate, allowing telegrams, from telegrams in the mid 1800s to telephones to even early fax machines going on at this time, and simple computers, things like that. Very, very interesting how much it allowed things to spread in the hobby, but in the world too. And so inventions just got more and more complex, and allowed technology to get cheaper and cheaper. So it wasn't just the elite that had fish. It was anybody who was willing to spend, a fair amount of money could have them. So the next fish that we see are bettas, and it's not until 1909 that the betta makes it into the hobby, which a lot of people might assume that betta splendens would have been there earlier. but it really wasn't unless you were stationed in Thailand or stationed in Singapore or something like that. However, we now know, and again, check out my channel if you want to learn more about this. We've just examined this year their mitochondrial DNA, and we found that they have recessive genes that have been bred in them for over 1,200 years, meaning that they have been being kept in a small population, selected recessive over and over and over, and culled for any domestic genes, and kept separate from that, and then crossed with other things. Basically patterns that we now know through DNA, through studying DNA, they're just not natural. It had to be humans that were keeping them in these ways. And what we knew before that was that they'd been kept at least, kind of around 400 years or so, we assumed. We knew that they were around in Thailand early on. But it has really blown our understanding out of the water now. And as I show you pictures of this, I tried to pick kind of a similar color morph where you get this kind of drab red and stripe kind of look. And then you get the, spawning color. They can color up a little more wild. They're not quite like this. And you start getting bigger fins. And then humans start doing, the full moon, half moon. They start crossing them with other bettas. Now today you see like the alien bettas and things like that. But then you start seeing the weird noodly fins, as I call them. No offense to anybody who likes them. And till the point where now we're really seeing like people fully using the genetics with like computer charts of what's recessive, what's dominant, what's co-dominant, what's recessive, or what has several chromosomes or several genes involved, what's epigenetic, and you can feed them things like carotenoids to bring out the reds. Turns out though that the red color in the fish is actually linked, as well as with the melanin in fish, is linked to aggression. And so while these fish were not kept by the Thai people as a quote unquote aquarium fish, they may have been kept in ponds or in ceramic vases or bowls. They would use them to settle disputes, and they would also use them for gambling. And it's actually all the way down in an area that is a phenomenal place if you've never heard of it, Angkor Wat in Cambodia. It is one of the biggest temple complexes in the world. They had something like 8 square miles of lakes around this main temple complex. And it appears that they stocked it with betta that were domesticated. And this is by 1100 to 1500. So we may have fish rivaling the age of some of the first goldfish. It could be as long as 1500, 2000 years that these fish have been around and been a part of the human wonder of, keeping a fish, breeding a fish, putting different traits into it. And we found these rock things that we call stelas in archaeology that was carved by a Buddhist leader in around 900 that says, you will not keep bettas. It's a decree from basically like a leader in an area. You will not keep bettas. You will not keep half beaks because they are leading to violence. They are leading to drunkenness. They are leading to disputes over money. And we don't have the resources to deal with you guys getting all rowdy. So I find that really interesting. And those little stories, within the hobby, that's what I like to find out and explore more. But again, you start seeing just crazy color variation, and just about anything you could dream of now is in betta splendens, or the alien bettas that have the betta machiensis. And you've also got the betta splendens, probably a few other bettas crossed in too. And another one that's going to surprise some people, but by 1906, we've got the Corydora Peliatus, and that is the pepper cory. And this fish, which isn't amazing looking necessarily on its own, I think they're adorable. I love Corydoras, but these fish actually were discovered, first written about by Charles Darwin. He stopped in Buenos Aires and he found that somebody was keeping these in basically like a ceramic bathtub, and that they were tolerant enough of the cool air that he just kind of noted, oh, that's a cool little catfish. And then he went on. Whereas later on, there was someone else who came back and kind of followed his tracks and was able to take note of it and say like, hey, this would probably make a good species for aquariums if it can survive in Buenos Aires. That can get cold sometimes there. Maybe we can bring it back to Europe or to America. And so they did. And this was one of the earlier fish in the hobby as far as any sort of catfish or small catfish. Other than that, it was really mad toms and little like bullheads and things like that that people were keeping in the hobby. So I found that whole story a little bit interesting, even though he didn't describe them scientifically. He didn't go report to the taxonomy folks back in Europe who were sorting out names and all that. But he did find them, and it was on his ship, the Beagle, in 1842, and later an ichthyologist by the name of Jennings, Jeyns. He later described them, probably 1846 is the first paper published. And even though we couldn't keep them outside of semi-warm places, they still were known about. So same with angelfish. People were getting stories about these. So that's the thing I forgot to mention was, people are getting stories and seeing papers published by naturalists going to these places and by people going to these places. And they thought, I got to get my hands on that, In fact, the first angelfish that were bred in America were in New York City in 1917. And a guy by the name of Frank Locke, who's a legend on West Coast fish history, who had the biggest aquarium store. He also started the San Francisco Bay Aquarium Club and Society. Today the San Francisco brand of bloodworms, those are actually still from what the club used to sell, dehydrated and frozen by the 1940s. To fish keepers, and that helped raise money for their club, and then they would pay for expeditions and things to go get more fish. So they were a pretty trailblazing club in that sense. And we have the same thing going on in Chicago, St. Louis, New York. You have all sorts of clubs, Hamburg, Germany, Paris, Berlin, Marseille. And as you can see here, if we take a glance one more time at the wild type, we've done a few things to these fish in recent years too. You got the high fin or the sail fin. You've got the long fin or tall fin, and then you've got the really tall fin where it almost looks like it broke and it needs a little coffee to perk it up. So then, if we get into things, we can talk about the next round of things, and these aren't well documented, unfortunately. But a lot of the things like the black Haitian cichlid, things like Jack Dempsey, the red devil, or the green terrors, the kind of quote unquote mean Central American but pretty fish that were bigger, they start coming in that same 1910 era. And really, there's so many fish coming in from in between World War I and World War II that we kind of lose track. So unless you can find an article saying this is the first shipment of this newly discovered fish that doesn't have a name yet, and we're calling it this, it's really hard to know when it entered the hobby. But there's a lot of illustrations that look very similar to these as early as the teens and like 1910, 1911. And it wouldn't be a big jump if you think of all the other fish like platies, guppies, mollies that are coming out of Central America too. Well, not guppies, but yeah. So swordtails are kind of the other big thing that went through a big craze as well. And you can see what we've done with those, just like all the others. We do all sorts of crazy things to them. And what is new, or what is old is new again, trying to mimic the koi. This is kind of several layers of fish inception, as I like to call it. And then, we also still find wild varieties. I can't recall off the top of my head whose fish this was, but somebody sent me this and was like, this is a wild strain. Can you believe it? It was the fella in St. Louis that was touring his cichlid house, and I'm totally spacing on his name. What's his name? Rich, or anyways, I'm sorry. Somebody will know, but my apologies. I shouldn't have even mentioned a name. But yeah, so that is the story there. And then the last bit, the last fish that I really want to talk about are all the incredible like blue galaris and fundula panchax and the orange chin, peach chin, red chin, yellow chin, all the different variations of fish. If you go through the Axelrod book that was, or the Innis book of like the Encyclopedia of Tropical Fish or Aquarium Fish from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, any of those volumes, there's just like a quarter of the book is different variations of these fish that are just subtly have one more, stripe on the caudal peduncle, or one more set of dots, or red instead of blue in one spot. And so these are kind of a taxonomist dream. Also, the thing that they didn't know, and probably would have really helped keep breeding them earlier, is just how resilient these were. They could take eggs, especially of the annual Achilles, and they could put them on a ship, and the temperature and stuff didn't matter as much, as long as they didn't freeze. They were in a state of torpor, or basically fish hibernation within these eggs. And if you knew the right conditions, you could keep them in suspended animation, essentially. And they figured that out by the late 19 teens and 20s, and they start doing that. And killifish kind of take on this cult-like status, and there's keepers of killifish alone, and clubs popping up just for that, kind of like the AKA today. But I want to tell you one last story, and we'll kind of wrap things up. And that is about the German club in Hamburg, Germany, that makes DATS magazine, or Dots magazine. They who came up with the L numbers, and they're kind of like the Tropical Fish Hobbyist magazine was in America, and Axelrod who ran that. I don't like to teach history in a way where we just talk about the figure and the thing that happened in the year that it happened necessarily. I like to look at trends, and I think it's usually a couple people doing similar things that inspire one another, and then someone gets the breakthrough and gets the credit, and the other people get forgotten. And there's just as much value in learning about all those things that led up to that moment of that spark of ingenuity, or revolution, or change. And so I don't necessarily subscribe to the quote unquote big man history where one person gets the credit. But with these, they actually, by 1928 in Germany, the DATS organization, they took an ocean liner that was built at the same docks as the Titanic, that obviously their brand had been a bit tarnished after a few incidents that had gone on, like the Titanic. And a very wealthy member of the club bought out, as well as with the club and a few importers, they bought out 2 levels of a ocean liner ship, and they put hundreds of aquariums in there, like 220 aquariums in there. And they would do, they brought a giant water tank, like a cistern that would collect rainwater, and they could do water changes with, and they had a whole crew of interns and grad students on board. And they parked this ship off the Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast as it was called then, and places like Ghana and Liberia. And they would just slowly troll along the coast and then stop for a week or two while expeditions would go in, collect fish, come back to the ship, and put them on there. So as early as that jump in 20 years, you go from barely able to keeping guppies and swordtails and things, to expeditions across the ocean, to foreign lands in near the equator, where they're collecting literally that first trip that they did. They came back with 168 brand new species and something like 210 species total. And then they sold them, and they traded them throughout the hobby. And, World War II kind of put another kink in things. But after that, people returned with a vengeance to the hobby. And I already mentioned this, so we don't need to go through it again. But the Danio was discovered. And the thing that I wanted to mention about it being discovered in 1904 and entering the hobby, which is later than some people might assume, since it is a pretty hardy fish. It was introduced by a guy by the name of Paul Mattei, and he was native. He was native of Berlin, but he called this thing the zebrafish. And his whole life after publishing that first account and pictures, he was like, Why did I call it the zebrafish? The stripes are going the wrong damn way. So you'll find quotes of him basically pulling his hair out in articles to journalists saying like, I don't know why I called it that. Its stripes are totally the wrong way. But early on, they did the things with the long fins. The same kind of mutations seem to be very common in a lot of our fish when we start line breeding them. The albinism, the melanism, and the long fins, short fins, lack of scales, the balloon body, things like that. But another thing that I wanted to point out is check this out. So here is a list of current hybrid and current Danio species from the region, specifically where this is about a 300-mile coastline. You can find all these types of Danios, and some of these are kind of man-made hybrids, but you can find all of these. And so it's very likely that some of the things like the what we call today the Kythit Danio or the gold ring Danio, the Tinwinii, that those were also being brought in as zebra or leopard Danios because they were considering zebra and leopard Danios the same species quite often. Now, where I want to end with this speech for you guys is the future. What are we going to do with fish next? How far has it come since we were barely able to keep them alive and didn't know ammonia was the thing killing them? And fountains just happened to be aerating them for us and all these things. Well, now we've gotten to the point where these fish were first imported as, what do you think? They were imported as a drug, literally under a patent for a drug, not as an animal when they were first brought in. And now they're being handled by a Texas company. And I'm sure a lot of you guys know about that or may even breed them down there. But they're ever popular, and maybe it's expanding fish to a new horizon, to a new generation. But whether you love them or hate them, humans will continue to line breed, to genetically breed, to play with epigenetics and also regular genetics. And I just feel like looking at this compared to this tells a lot about us humans and what we'll do for a flashy fish and the amount of millions in research and things that went on there. So I want to thank you guys again for having me speak here, and I want to say sorry that I didn't make it down. I know there was a hurricane in the way, and so it kind of makes it a little less personal. I'd love to meet a lot of you, and I love going collecting down there. But thank you guys so much for your time. Anybody else who is joining us, always good to have you guys. And if you're catching one of my speeches ever, they're always different every time. I try to tailor them a little bit different and a little talking about something new that I haven't discussed yet in each one. So thank you so much. And also just wanted to give a shout out to the folks who organized all this at your club and for getting me involved. It really does mean a lot. And even though I'm still a little nervous about the talking thing, and for some reason I'm more nervous talking digitally than I am in person, I can't see your reactions or anything. I really appreciate it, and it's really fun to do. And I hope to come down and meet a lot of y'all sometime in the near future. So thank you so very much. It means a lot. So hey guys, that's kind of the end of the presentation. If you have any questions though, feel free to ask away. Either we can do it one of two ways. It is a public stream. If you go to Secret History Living in Your Aquarium, you can talk in the stream. And the other thing is either Paul or Joe have a straight line to me at your club down in Venice. So if you have questions, they could ask me too. So yeah. What species, Mick M says, what species of fish are getting, oh, okay, sorry, never mind. That's amongst each other. So yeah, oh, you're at Venice. Good to hear. Divide by zero. Good to hear. Thank you. I'm glad the topic was of some interest. So yeah. And Takari, thank you also. Yeah, and sorry about all that you guys have gone through at that club down there in Fort Myers too. I hope you guys are doing okay, and those of you who were just slammed by it and everything, that was affected, whether it was fish rooms or people's lives being upended, and the stress of, damage to houses and things, and losing fish when the power's out. Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that, you guys. So yeah. Oh, I missed a ton. Okay, let me see what else I'm missing. I am working through a StreamYard, so we'll see. Uh, I don't necessarily see all the questions on here. I can pull it up though. Uh, yeah, yeah. And then Paul also said I was the tester for trying the YouTube meeting, talk meeting, and so yeah, we figured it out at the end of the day. We ended up just getting it squared away. All right, yeah, you guys need to start your auction at the club. Log off. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great one. I'll talk to anybody else who's here still alive for a moment, but thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and take care, guys. Bye. First class fish. We want to know who your stylist is. Well, my stylist is me having a crazy hair in my brain and cutting all my hair off in the middle of the night. Uh, all right, let's see here. Anybody in the live chat that wants to uh, say anything? Let me pull up the actual stream. Hopefully, we won't get the ringing, the incessant ringing. Hopefully. Um, all right, let's see here. Oh, interesting. Uh, yeah, Divide by Zero says, um, I am reminded that many ecosystems in the world were functionally destroyed by the modern hobby. And by the time the modern hobby got access to it, did you, in your research, come across any stories? Many stories of fish that are just gone that people noted. And a lot of times we think, is that just some cryptozoology craziness that they came up with? And unless they brought a specimen back, it never would have been believed, some of the crazy things that exist, especially in ocean regions too. But I mean, for instance, the guppies, the lagoon where they were discovered was quickly destroyed and environmentally, and guppies that had been domesticated for 30 years were re-released into the lagoon. Same thing with endlers, where they were discovered in the late 1960s, early 1970s, 72 usually people say. That area, they're pretty much all but extinct in now. There are a few places where you still find some, but most of them have domesticated lines in them. And all over the Caribbean, you can say, oh, we have millions fish or we have guppies. But it turns out that almost all of them, when genetically tested, are domestic. And same with bettas in the wild. A lot of bettas have domesticated betta splendens lines in them, especially if they're in that genus. But specifically the betta splendens, you really have to go to kind of remote areas to find that. And we don't know if some of that is maybe they were kept in rice paddies and when it flooded, they got out that way, or if people just let them go or what. But yeah, it is a real bummer. Also, the thing is, there's a lot of fish that never stop growing, like lake trout, and they don't stop growing. They'll live for a really long time and still until illness or something takes them out. So things like sturgeon that are 24 feet long, and you see pictures from the turn of the century with like 30 guys lined up along a sturgeon. Tales of the stingrays in the Mekong Delta, also in the Yangtze River, all the different things like the paddlefish and the dolphins that were there, and there was something else that just went extinct there as well. Or yeah, so there's definitely a lot of examples of that. Right off the top of my head, I can't think of a ton where something was discovered and then gone by the time they went to collect it. Usually they at least got like a specimen jar. But I can tell you that what happened a lot of times on those sailing ships is they were not naturalist crews. There was like one naturalist who caught a ride on board with the ship doing something else, like running gold or surveying for a map or whatever it may have been. And the ship people throughout the 1800s just notoriously would open formaldehyde and methylene, ethylene, you name it, any type of liquid that they were keeping fish in, they would drink it because they were out of their ration of grog or rum or whatever it was at the time. So a lot of specimens were totally trashed and ruined by sailors. That happened like so many times. I can't even tell you on the manifest where it's just like ruined by crew, discipline applied, or whatever, some sort of statement like that. It's just crazy. Um, uh, let's see here. Alex, are there any good documentaries on the hobby, especially the history of the hobby? I especially love seeing the Victorian era stuff. You know, I haven't come across any really thorough ones. I've done a couple videos on it. Some are getting older now, and so I'm trying to continue to do presentations around the country and to tell a different story each time. I've been researching this for, I mean, the better part of 7 or 8 years now, full time for 3 years. So I have a lot of stories to tell, and I have a lot of things that I've not edited or put together into a video, but that I could easily talk about more. And so I am trying to put all the pieces together so that I have all the notes and all the sources that I use and things, pictures and things like that, permission from people to use their pictures, um, so that I have that when if I do make a book or if somebody would want to work with me on editing an actual documentary. So yeah, but there may be a story out there. I just haven't seen one. There's some on Koi. There's a German one that was on, their equivalent of National Geographic or some sort of educational channel where they talk about the early aquarium trade, um, and the early expos in Europe. But that's about the closest thing that I can think of. There is also the owner of ZoomEd down in San Luis Obispo, who has 5 warehouses full of Victorian era, I mean, Art Deco era, Art Nouveau, like you name it, he's got it. Different aquariums, but he really did like that Victorian era cast iron and gilded stuff. And it's going to be open to the public at some point. But he has a channel called like the History of Aquarium Museum or Aquarium Museum channel. You'll find it if you search for that on YouTube, I think. Um, oh, right on ABC. You're gonna start a new journey, taking ichthyology and biology classes, dude. That is awesome. Congrats, congrats, congrats. That is really rad. Um, yeah, that is really neat. Hey, Sky Dancer. All right, guys. So I think I'm gonna sign off here. Um, I hope it was interesting to folks. This is like an example of one of the talks. A lot of my talks are 10 things that changed the hobby forever, and that goes all the way back to like Neolithic times and talking about Polynesians and fish ponds and spear and net culture and technology. So I love to talk about the early history. I haven't gotten into like the 1960s up till now history that much on my channel, and that's something that I'm aware I need to. I just haven't felt the urgency that I feel with like documents getting destroyed and getting lost in other things. So yeah. Lady Rorschach, what's up? Yeah, feel free to watch the replay. It's totally a presentation for the Venice Aquarium Society. And because of the hurricane and everything going on, it's just too chaotic to get down there and try to find time and place to give the talk. So I just wanted to give the speech to them, and then anything that they would have paid me, I just said, keep it, put it back towards any club members that need help or whatnot. So I'm happy to talk essentially for free. So if you have a club or an event or something where you would like me to come talk, or even we could tailor a talk about your region, I just need to brush up, pull through my files and scraps of paper with notes on them and books. And I can put together something pretty much anywhere in America or Western Europe. I've got a pretty thorough history on that I can go back and do a talk on. So I'm trying to do that and show people that you can share your speech openly, publicly. It doesn't need to be behind locked doors, especially since I'm not doing any lifelong research. There's no secret sauce that I'm putting on a certain species of fish to make it breed that no one else knows or anything like that. I'm just regurgitating and organizing, maybe organizing, chaotically organizing the information that's out there and combing through it and trying to put it back together so we can get an accurate idea. Because a lot of the history that's been written on aquariums or on anything for that matter, they don't have the whole picture when it's at the time of these things occurring. So they may very well think that they are the best aquarium club or the richest aquarium club in the world at the time, especially before telephones and internet and mass publication of things quickly reaching each other. So I think that's even happens today. People just don't know. And I hear people say, oh, I have the biggest shrimp room, or I have the biggest cichlid collection, or I have, whatever it may be. And then you find out there's someone who's 10 times bigger. So at the time, you kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt, then look at all the pieces, step back and kind of say, all right, I can kind of confirm this. All right, there's pictures of it there. So we know this fish made it this far. I don't know who imported it. That's clearly a zebra acara or whatever, so it's kind of like a puzzle, and I always love that about it. So let's see here. Yes, free education, come to Canada, Fish Tropic says, yeah, or to this channel. So if you like what I'm doing, could you talk about the tropical fish? Wait, could you do a talk about the tropical fish? We have the Malay shrimp here, but can't find much info about it. Yeah, I mean, I could definitely look into it. I don't know anything about that off the top of my head. I know a lot about Silawese. Well, I shouldn't say I know a lot. I'm not some expert, but I Myanmar and like Inlay is another spot that I happen to just absolutely be fascinated with and love. I've given talks on there on this channel, and I've given them live as well. So yeah, feel free to drop any questions. Email me at alexanderjwilliamson@gmail.com. J as in jet. And yeah, there's a lot of species with no records. That's for sure true, Craig. Um, but yeah, and I have videos on Malawa shrimp if that's what you're wondering about. I do have videos on those. So guys, I gotta bounce because I gotta touch base with some other folks organizing this. But oh, okay, it is Melee. Yeah. So I'll definitely have to check that out. I don't know much about it. So I will. I don't know if it's Caridina or what it is. If you know the genus, that'd be super helpful. But just so I know we're not talking about two different things. But yeah. All right, guys. Thanks for joining in. If you joined in, and if you're here, yeah, have a great night. I'll talk to you later. I'm going to try to leave this as much of a presentation as I can so the club can go back and see it and so that other people can too. All right, guys, take care of yourselves. Take care of your critters. And of course, have a great night and great day wherever you are. I'll talk to you guys soon. I'll be streaming again tomorrow. So around 4:30 p.m. also. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.